The gravel crunched under Elijah Vance's boots, a sound that usually brought him peace. At 64, Elijah was a man of quiet rhythms. He liked the way the morning mist clung to the surface of Blackwood Lake, and he loved the deep, ancient silence of the 300 acres of valley land his grandfather had bought back when a black man owning property in this county was considered a provocation. But today, the silence was gone. In its place was the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of nail guns and the roar of heavy machinery. Elijah stood at the rusted barbed wire fence that marked his northern boundary. On the other side sat the Ridges, a high-end, gated community that had been creeping toward his property line for 3 years. At the helm of the Ridges was Brenda Sterling, the president of the Homeowners Association and a woman who viewed property lines as mere suggestions. "Morning, Elijah." The voice was high-pitched and sharp. Brenda was marching down the slope, her pristine white sneakers somehow avoiding the mud. She held a clipboard like a shield. Behind her, a row of nearly finished modern rustic cabins stood in a perfect military line. "Brenda," Elijah nodded slowly, "those cabins look a little close to the creek bed." Brenda laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Nonsense, we've optimized the footprint. In fact, we've expanded the wilderness retreat phase of the development. These 100 units are already pre-sold. They're the crown jewel of the Ridges." Elijah hooked his thumbs into his belt loops. "Except they aren't on your land, Brenda. I had the surveyors out last month. You've crossed the creek. You've built nearly 24 of those cabins on the Vance estate, and the rest of them, they're sitting right in the basin." Brenda's smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned cold. "Elijah, don't be difficult. That basin hasn't seen a drop of water in 50 years. It's a dry meadow. As for the boundary, our maps show the creek as the line. Nature shifts. We've improved the land. You should be thanking us. Your property value is skyrocketing because of me." "I don't care about the value," Elijah said softly. "I care about the dirt. You're over the line. I'm giving you a chance to move the equipment and settle the encroachment before things get complicated." Brenda stepped closer, her perfume clashing with the scent of pine. "Listen to me, old man. I have a board of directors, a legal team, and the backing of the county council. You're one man living in a shack. Don't try to play David against my Goliath. You'll lose." She turned on her heel and shouted to a foreman, "Keep those crews moving. We finish the roofing by Friday." Elijah watched her walk away. He wasn't angry, he was patient. He knew something Brenda didn't. He knew why his grandfather had bought this specific patch of land in 1948. He knew why the dry meadow had stayed dry for half a century. The paper trail. For the next 2 weeks, Elijah did everything by the book. He filed a formal cease and desist. He sent certified letters to the HOA board. He even invited Brenda to a mediation meeting at the local diner. She didn't show. Instead, she sent a junior lawyer who offered Elijah a generous settlement of $5,000 to sign over the disputed 50 acres. Elijah had politely declined and spent the afternoon in the county archives. He met his friend Marcus, a retired civil engineer at the town's small library. "You find it?" Marcus asked, leaning over a stack of yellowed maps. "Right here," Elijah pointed to a blueprint from 1952, "the Blackwood Dam and Diversion Project. When the state built the main reservoir, they gave my grandfather a private easement. Because the creek on our land feeds the lower valley, he was given the right to manage the flow to prevent his cattle from drowning during the floods." Marcus whistled. "The Vance Dam, it's a gravity-fed spillway. If you open those gates, that dry meadow becomes the primary drainage basin for the entire North Ridge." "Brenda built 100 cabins in a bowl," Elijah said, his voice steady. "And she did it by diverting the natural runoff into a concrete culvert that she tucked onto my land. She's been pumping the groundwater out to keep the foundations dry during construction." "If you stop those pumps or open the spillway," Marcus started. "I'm not a mean man, Marcus," Elijah said, "but she's calling me a squatter on my own porch. She's ignored every legal warning. She thinks the law is something she can buy." The gala. The grand opening of the Ridge's wilderness phase was a lavish affair. Brenda had spared no expense. Tents were erected, champagne was poured, and the 100 cabins sparkled under decorative string lights. Potential buyers and local dignitaries wandered through the site, admiring the natural beauty of the meadow. Elijah stood on the ridge above the valley, standing next to a massive, rusted iron wheel housed in a small stone shed. The shed was overgrown with ivy, looking like nothing more than an old tool shed to the untrained eye. He looked at his watch. A storm was rolling in from the west, a 100-year washout, according to the weather reports. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. Down in the valley, he saw Brenda taking the stage. Through his binoculars, he could see her glowing, holding a microphone. "Welcome to the future of luxury," she cried out. "We've turned this forgotten wilderness into a sanctuary." Elijah gripped the iron wheel. It was well-oiled. He'd spent the last 3 nights cleaning the gears. He pulled out his phone and dialed Brenda's number. To his surprise, she picked up. "Elijah, if you're calling to beg for that 5,000, the offer is down to 3, she mocked. The sound of the wind was picking up on her end. "Brenda, look up at the ridge," Elijah said. He saw her turn, squinting against the first drops of rain. "I'm standing at the spillway," Elijah said. "I've sent the county records to the sheriff and the Department of Environmental Quality. Your cabins are built on a designated flood control easement. I have the legal obligation to maintain the water level of Blackwood Lake, and the lake is getting too high, Brenda." "You wouldn't dare," she hissed. "That's private property." "My land is private property," Elijah replied. "The meadow belongs to the water. I warned you 3 times. You chose to build in a bathtub." With a grunt of effort, Elijah began to turn the wheel. The sound was tectonic. Deep underground, massive steel plates that hadn't moved in decades began to slide. The groan of the metal echoed off the hills. At first it was just a trickle, then a roar. A wall of water held back for 50 years surged into the diversion channel. It didn't come as a wave of destruction but as an inevitable rising tide. The deluge. Down in the valley, the party ended instantly. The dry meadow began to soak up the water like a sponge, but the volume was too much. Within 10 minutes, the manicured lawns were under 6 inches of water. "The pumps," Brenda screamed at her foreman. "Turn on the auxiliary pumps." "The water's coming from the ridge, Brenda," the man shouted back, struggling to move a generator. "The culverts are backed up, there's too much volume." The guests scrambled for their luxury SUVs as the water reached the porch steps of the lowest cabins. The wilderness retreat was rapidly becoming a swamp. Elijah watched from above. He wasn't joyful, but he felt a profound sense of balance. The land was reclaiming its shape. The cabins, built with optimized footprints, which was Brenda's code for shallow, cheap foundations, began to shift. The soil in the basin, a mix of silt and clay, turned into a slurry. One of the unoccupied cabins on the far end groaned as its front porch tilted into the rising muck. Brenda stood on a high rock, her white outfit ruined, her hair plastered to her face. She watched as the centerpiece of her career began to literally sink. By sunset, the meadow was a lake. 100 cabins sat like wooden islands in 3 feet of murky water. The expensive landscaping was gone, replaced by the debris of the forest. The aftermath. The legal fallout was swifter than the flood. Because Elijah had documented every warning and provided the 1952 easement papers, the HOA's insurance companies refused to pay out. They cited gross negligence and building in a known flood easement against legal notice. The Ridge's HOA was hit with a class-action lawsuit from the presale buyers. Brenda Sterling was ousted from the board within 48 hours, and the county began an investigation into how her permits were approved in the first place. A week later, Elijah was back on his porch, rocking slowly in a cedar chair. The water had been lowered back to its manageable level, but the meadow remained a marsh, unbuildable and ruined for development. A car pulled up the long, dirt driveway. It was a modest sedan, not the luxury SUV Brenda used to drive. She got out of the car slowly. She looked tired. The fire was gone, replaced by a hollow kind of defeat. She walked to the edge of his porch but didn't come up the steps. "The demolition crews start tomorrow," she said, her voice raspy. "The county ordered the removal of all 100 structures. The HOA is bankrupt. I'm personally liable for the environmental cleanup." Elijah didn't say anything. He just kept rocking. "Why didn't you just take the money?" she asked, a genuine note of confusion in her voice. "You could have moved anywhere. You could have lived like a king." Elijah stopped rocking. He looked out over the valley where the herons were already returning to the newly formed wetlands. "My grandfather didn't buy this land to be a king, Brenda," Elijah said. "He bought it because he wanted a place where the world couldn't move him. You thought you could move me because you had a clipboard and a title, but you forgot that the land has the final say." Brenda looked out at the skeletons of the cabins, half submerged in the mud. "I lost everything." "No," Elijah said firmly, "you just lost what wasn't yours to begin with." The quiet return. The cleanup took a year. The wilderness phase was dismantled piece by piece. The wood was hauled away, the concrete foundations were jackhammered out, and the soil was graded back to its natural slope. As part of the settlement, the HOA was forced to cede the disputed 50 acres back to the Vance estate, along with a buffer zone to ensure future hydrologic stability. Elijah stood at his fence line one evening, a year to the day after the flood. The dry meadow was green again, but it was a different kind of green, vibrant, wild, and thick with the sounds of frogs and crickets. The fence was no longer rusted. He'd replaced it with sturdy locust posts and high tensile wire, not to keep people out but to mark the boundary of a legacy. He looked up at the ridge. The big houses of the ridges were still there, perched high on the hill, but they felt smaller now. They looked like guests who had finally learned to respect their host. Elijah turned back toward his small, well-kept house. He had no neighbors in the valley, and that was exactly how he liked it. The water was where it belonged, the land was back in his name, and the silence had finally returned to Blackwood Lake. He went inside, poured a glass of tea, and sat by the window. He had spent his whole life being told that men like him were temporary fixtures on the landscape. But as he watched the moon reflect off the water in the basin, he knew better. He had dropped the gates, and in doing so, he had washed away the arrogance of those who thought they could own the earth without loving it. The story of the Vances wasn't written in bank accounts or HOA bylaws. It was written in the mud, the water, and the enduring strength of a man who knew exactly where his line was drawn. And as the night settled in, Elijah Vance slept with the deep, easy peace of a man whose land was finally at rest.